I thought that we would look at a lot of the really good lessons that are in Ezra and Nehemiah. There's some good lessons in Esther, so we might take a look at that book afterwards. But in the whole span of all of the Old Testament books, where do Ezra and Nehemiah sit? In all of the Old Testament books, if we sang the song, where do the Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah sit? How many books in the Old Testament? 39. Where do Ezra and Nehemiah sit in the Old Testament? Roughly where? Roughly in the middle. They're actually just before the middle of the Old Testament. Roughly just before the middle of the Old Testament. Does anyone know, just by the way, and so this will get it captured on camera and anyone who watches will know. Do you know what the middle chapter of the Bible is? Psalm 118. Very good. Middle chapter. Psalm 119 is the longest. You're really going to impress me if you get this. Psalm 117, if I'm not mistaken, is the shortest. Isn't that weird? I'm sure it's just purely coincidental. 118 is the middle, 119 is the longest, 117 is the shortest. Did someone plan that out? I doubt it. But it is very oddly coincidental that it is the case. So that just means that Ezra and Nehemiah are just barely shy of the middle of the Old Testament. But the really odd thing is, when you start looking at it in history, it's very, very different. So as we get into Ezra chapters 1, 2, and 3, we're going to look at a God-stirred spirit and why we need to have God-stirred spirit. So Ezra and Nehemiah will have 7 or 8 different lessons for us. But for us to begin, I want to just kind of set this stage of Ezra, Nehemiah, and also of Esther to kind of understand the timeline. And I know that it's small, but it's effective to kind of get all of it in there. So while Ezra and Nehemiah are in the middle of the Old Testament, in time they're actually where? In time, they're actually at the end. The end. And sometimes that really throws people when you're talking to particularly people who don't know anything or know very, very little about the Bible. In time, why does it end in the middle? And then when you start, because Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, then what's the next book? Job. And funny enough, with Job, you go all the way back, probably predating Moses. Probably predating Moses, which means it predated Genesis. It's really interesting. And again, sitting down and telling someone this for the first time is also very, very interesting. I didn't put those books in that order. It's not my fault. But anyway, we just try to make as much sense of it as we can. Do what now? Yes, they do sell chronological Bibles. Yes, they sure do. Yeah. And those are even more interesting because, well, as I'm about ready to point out, even that sometimes isn't easy. Okay, so let's go through this. First of all, in 538 and 537, you have the first return of the Jews under Zerubbabel. This is going to be the very first thing that we look at in just a few minutes or next week. Then you have in 537, 536, the altar is built and the foundation is laid of the temple in Ezra chapter 3. That turns out to be a significant event in latter Old Testament history. Then in 536 to 520, the work on the temple actually stops, so it stops for about 15 years. Then in 520, you have the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah. So after the book of Ezra starts, you have Haggai and Zechariah in that period of time. That's why even chronological Bibles do the best that they can, but even then there's still a little bit of jumping around, just a little bit. 520, the temple construction then resumes. 518, the preaching of Zechariah. 515, the temple is completed. 586, the Jews opposed in the beginning of Xerxes, which is Ezra. Then moving on in the book of Ezra, will be in Ezra chapter 4. But then in 583, Xerxes holds a feast, and that's Esther's 1, 2, then 3 through 10. Haman plans to kill the Jews. So it's like right in the middle of the book of Ezra is where the book of Esther ought to go. So again, that's why, I'm thankful that someone has tried to put the Bible in a chronological order, but even there you can see that sometimes it's not an easy thing to do. And particularly, let me say this, it's easy for us to conceptualize, but I promise you, if you sit down with someone who only knows that the Bible is called the Bible, this is really, really hard to explain. And there's a lot of people out there, and their knowledge pretty much goes literally that the only thing they know about the Bible is that it's called the Bible. So we try to do our very best to explain it. So we have now in 564 to 523, the Jews opposed in Artaxerxes' reign. This is now you're getting into Ezra, in the latter part of the book of Ezra, chapter 7. The second return of the Jews under Ezra, Ezra chapter 7 through 10. For example, when the Jews went into captivity, which is before we ever get to Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, how many different groups were there that went into captivity? There were 3 of them. Now again, I guess it's just coincidence. How many came out of captivity? 3 of them. 2 of them are in Ezra. One of them is with Zerubbabel. That's the first part of Ezra. Then Ezra, which is the second part of Ezra. Again, it is somewhat confusing to keep track of. Ezra's return, which is the second one, is the second half of Ezra, and then who returns? Nehemiah. So Nehemiah 445 to 433 BC, Nehemiah returns and builds the walls. Then in 433 to 432, Nehemiah recalls and then he returns. And then in 432 to 425, the preaching of Malachi. And I do want to emphasize that some of these dates are very, very approximate. Some could be pretty close, some could be off by, several years. But probably the preaching of Malachi fits pretty well. So you can see Ezra and Nehemiah are really at the tail end of Old Testament history. Ezra is a book that's basically divided into 2 from 2 different returns. And then once you take the book of Ezra and you divide it in 2, the book of Esther fits in between the 2 parts. And so does Haggai and Zechariah. You see what I mean by this? It's not, you've got to keep the chronology down. And we'll keep going through this chronology to kind of remind us about how these, now we've involved about 6 different books out of the 39 books and how they fall chronologically at the very end. Okay, let's go to Ezra now. Ezra chapter 1. So Ezra chapter 1, the beginning of Ezra chapter 1 sounds exactly like the ending of what? Bonus points if you get this. But you guys have been throwing out some really outstanding answers, so I have faith. Sounds exactly like the end of 2 Chronicles. Sounds exactly like the end of 2 Chronicles, which has led many, many people to believe who wrote Chronicles. Ezra. Okay? Again, since I've got a little bit of time and can't go very far in the next minute, First and Second Kings covers, not surprisingly, the time of what? Of all of the kings, from Solomon all the way to the end, all of them going into captivity. What does First and Second Chronicles cover? The same thing, except First and Second Kings does it from a political point of view. So it tells you what happens with Israel and with Judah. First and Second Chronicles only talks about what? Judah. Judah. Doesn't mention Israel. And while First and Second Kings does it more from a political point of view, First and Second Chronicles does it more from a religious point of view. The northern tribe of Israel never had a good king. The southern tribe of Judah actually had how many good kings out of 20? I would take two answers because sometimes they're somewhat disputed. I think there were 7. Sometimes people only say 6. I think there were probably 7. But those 7 good kings actually covered a lot of the time that country was in existence. So 2 Chronicles talks all about particularly what happened in the good reigns of those kings. But it ends with them going into captivity, and then Ezra picks right up with them coming out of captivity. So that's what we'll study next time. Read Ezra 1, 2, and 3, and we'll start looking at those chapters.